Good day.
Today is Monday, 26th May 2025, and as you can see, I'm very much in the English countryside enjoying my holiday with my family. This inevitably is having an effect on the amount of time I can devote to making programs, and in addition, I have to struggle with connection issues. So for the time being at least, my videos are going to be shorter than they tended to be whilst I was in London. Apologies for this, but I'm sure you'll all understand the reasons for this. Anyway, let us now turn to the events of the last couple of hours, the last 24 hours. I've been saying in various programs recently that, in my opinion, the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are going nowhere. It's uncertain what the West is going to do, though it's quite clear to me that the Europeans, for their part, have no plan other than to keep on doing the same thing and expecting a different result. The same thing being imposing further sanctions on Russia. They're trying to get the United States to support them in this. Donald Trump doesn't seem to be at all keen. Even if the sanctions are imposed, it is going to make absolutely no difference. As for the Russians, they're pressing forward, preparing their memorandum, which apparently they will be delivering to Ukraine within the next couple of days, maybe this very week, in which they will set out the terms upon which they are prepared to end the war, which are in all essentials the identical terms to the ones that Vladimir Putin set out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. So, for the moment at least, as far as I can see, that there is really no sign that the diplomatic initiatives are leading anywhere. I think the President of the United States, Donald Trump, privately understands this. I think so do some of his officials. I think they recognize that Russia has the military initiative firmly in its hands, and I think they also understand that further sanctions against Russia would be gravely counterproductive and would not prevent the Russians from continuing to fund and support the war. And General Cavoli, the US military commander, who is the overall military commander of NATO, and who, as we know from a recent article in the New York Times, played an absolutely instrumental role in coordinating Ukraine's various offensives of 2022, the autumn of 2022 and 2023, and who, as his recent congressional testimony showed, remains a fervid supporter of Ukraine. Anyway, he has now come forward and said that the Russians can continue the war for at least 2 years based on the present losses. They still have that ability to continue for at least 2 more years. And as we will see shortly, it's doubtful that the Ukrainians have anything like that level of staying power. Now, I'm going to say quickly, before I proceed, that I think that General Cavoli is wrong in this. I think he is basing his ideas about Russian staying power on assumptions about Russian casualties, which are widespread in the West, which greatly overstate them. And I suspect also he's influenced by the many wrong perceptions, which still exist about the size of the Russian economy and its resilience in the face of sanctions. So I don't think it's 2 years. I think it is essentially indefinite. Vladimir Medinsky, the Russian chief negotiator, told the Ukrainians at the meeting in Istanbul on the 16th of May that the Russians will take as long as it needs in order to complete their objectives in Ukraine. He compared Russian resolve with the resolve that Russia showed during the 21-year Great Northern War, which Peter the Great won against Sweden in the early 18th century, and he seemed to imply that Russia's determination is at the same level, and if necessary, Russia could continue the war for as long as Peter the Great did back at that time, long ago. And I think he's right. I don't think that the war is causing stresses on Russian society or the economy or the military to anything like the extent that General Cavoli believes. I would repeat again that I've recently been to Russia. I was in St. Petersburg. That, at least, is my own overall assessment, judging the mood there and seeing the condition of the country, or at least of St. Petersburg, maybe not the whole country. Anyway, let's quickly do a rundown of the military situation, the latest military developments. As I said, I'm not going to devote as much time to this as perhaps I should, but anyway, this, it seems to me, briefly is the current situation. The Ukrainians and many other commentators in the West now assume that there will indeed be a big Russian offensive this summer. I have been saying this for some time. In fact, I have no doubt about it. The US intelligence community has recently published a report, or at least there is a report which they have provided. I'm not sure whether they published it, but anyway, they provided a report in which they say that Russian objectives in the conflict in Ukraine remain unchanged. That is true. If you go back to what Vladimir Putin said back at the time when he initiated the special military operation, you will see that it differs little from what Putin said in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, or from what Vladimir Medinsky said to the Ukrainians when they met on the 16th of May 2025. Of course, the US intelligence community puts it rather more starkly. They say that President Putin seeks to defeat Ukraine completely to achieve, in effect, its capitulation. I don't think that was true back in 2022. After all, President Putin did undertake a complex negotiation with Ukraine at that time, which resulted in the draft Istanbul Agreement of April 2022, which fell well short of demanding a total capitulation of Ukraine. In fact, I remember at that time that Ukrainian negotiators were telling the Financial Times that they regarded the outcome of the Istanbul negotiations of February, March, April 2022 as strongly favourable to Ukraine. In fact, they were bragging about their success in the negotiations. I would just mention all of that. You can go back, you can find those old articles in the Financial Times if you wish. But anyway, certainly the Russian objectives are unchanged, but I don't think they have the scope that the US intelligence community believes that they do. The other part of what the US intelligence community, however, reports, which is that President Putin considers success in the war existential for Russia, I absolutely endorse. I have no doubt at all that he does indeed think that, as does Russian society in general. And that explains the degree of support for the war that you would tend to find in Russia, the extent to which Russian society has consolidated around the war and is resolved to see it through. So that's what I would say about the American report, the intelligence community's report. I would add that, as I discussed in my program yesterday, once we have the Russian offensive, on the assumption that the Russians do gain significant new territory as a result of that offensive, it is likely that Russian demands will increase, as they have consistently done ever since the Maidan crisis began in February 2014. Just to reiterate, if in February March 2014, after the Maidan, the change of power caused by the events in Maidan in February 2014, if Ukraine had settled for the loss of Crimea and granted autonomy to the Donbass, as the people in Donbass were demanding, that would have been the end of the conflict. If Ukraine had implemented the Minsk Agreement of February 2015, which granted Donbass a degree of autonomy. The degree of that autonomy, by the way, has been consistently overstated. But if Ukraine had implemented the February 2015 Minsk Agreement, Donbass would still be part of Ukraine. If Ukraine had implemented the Istanbul April 2022 agreement, Russian objectives would have been limited to Donbass and, of course, Crimea. In June 2024, Putin escalated Russian demands. He said that the Ukrainians would need to agree to the transfer of the entire territory of the four regions to Russia, not just Donbass, in other words, but also Zaporozhye and Kherson. And the Russians are now hinting, and apparently they told the Ukrainians at the meeting in Istanbul on the 16th of May, that if the Ukrainians were not prepared to agree to the transfer of the four regions, then the Russians would demand more regions beyond that. And some Ukrainian officials are now saying that at the meeting in Istanbul on the 16th of May, the Russians actually demanded the transfer, threatened that the next regions that they would seek control over would be Kharkiv, Sumy region, and Dnipro region, increasing the number of regions that would fall under Russian control from 4 to 7 plus Crimea. So with every delay by Ukraine in coming to an agreement with Russia, with every retreat by Ukraine on the battlefronts, with every defeat Ukraine suffers, the demands from Moscow gradually grow, and, well, possibly, perhaps, eventually, if this pattern continues, we will end up with a situation where there is very little of Ukraine left. Now, Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, former prime minister of Russia, vice chairman of Russia's military industrial commission, basically said as much in the speech he gave to the legal forum in St. Petersburg, which I attended. He said that this latest set of negotiations is Ukraine's last chance. If they don't take it, the Russians will pursue Ukraine's unconditional surrender. Well, he has now followed that up. he is now saying that the buffer zone that President Putin is talking about, intended to protect Russian territory from potential Ukrainian attack, should extend to almost the entire territory of Ukraine. And he's actually even gone further. He's published a map in which he shows the entire territory of Ukraine either passing entirely under Russian control, becoming formally part of Russia, in the case of certain regions in the east, or becoming absorbed into some kind of demilitarized or buffer zone with only a tiny sliver of territory in the far west, essentially the territory known as Galicia, the former Habsburg province of Galicia, remaining entirely under Ukrainian control. Now, I think here probably Medvedev is trolling a little, but, well, it's probably a case of the shape of things to come if the war continues in the direction that it is. Well, what is the military situation then? The Russians are now working on their buffer zone. The Ukrainians have now finally acknowledged that the Russians do control a significant amount of territory in Sumy region. There are reports that following the capture of Lochnia, there is now confirmed fighting in the village of Yunakovka, the key village that links up the defense positions of the Ukrainian forces between the Russian border and the city of Sumy. I'm not saying, by the way, that if Yunakovka falls, the Russians will advance on Sumy itself, or that if they do, the capture of Sumy would be a straightforward matter. All I am saying is that Yunakovka at the moment forms the key part of Ukraine's defense system. Speaking, incidentally, of this area in northern Ukraine, it's also the case that the Russians are now apparently admitting that virtually the entire, or confirming that virtually the entire territory of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, has fallen entirely under their control. And it seems that they're making the first preparations to cross the Volcha River and to capture the remainder of Volchansk, which lies to the south of the Volcha River, which I understand is the smaller part of Volchansk. Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which I've talked about many times on many programs, says that the problem the Ukrainians have is that their forces defending Volchansk were severely depleted because of repeated transfers of troops from the Volchansk area to try to hold the Ukrainian positions in Kursk region before March, and of course the Ukrainian forces that were deployed to Kursk region have been massively devastated as a result of the defeat the Ukrainians suffered there. So Volchansk, it seems, is about to fall, or at least Volchansk north of the Volcha River is about to fall, and that is what Group of Forces North apparently is itself saying. Now, in the same region, in Kursk region, we've actually had a really rather strange and unexpected piece of news. Vladimir Putin recently visited this area, and he had meetings with people there, and he joked at that time with them about whether or not the city of Sumy should itself become one day part of the Russian buffer zone. But now we're told that whilst he was there, his helicopter apparently came under some kind of attack, and that the Russian military, had to protect it in some way from Ukrainian drones. This is a very strange story, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it myself. But the implication is that lots of Ukrainian drones were operating in the exact area through which President Putin's helicopter was passing, and that in order to protect Putin himself and his helicopter, the Russian military were having to shoot down all of these various Ukrainian drones. Was this an assassination attempt? Did the Ukrainians get wind of the fact that Putin was coming to Kursk region? If you read the Russian reports, it almost seems that way, except that they don't actually make that specific allegation. It is a little strange. It's been, by the way, reported, this story has also been reported in the Western media. If this was an attempted assassination attempt of Putin by the Ukrainians, then it would not be the first one. Kirill Budanov, the Ukrainian intelligence chief, has actually admitted that the Ukrainians have made several attempts to assassinate President Putin, though obviously all of them have been unsuccessful. I would say that attempting to assassinate Putin would be a disastrous mistake on the part of Ukraine. If they succeeded, a much more hardline figure would probably take his place, and there would almost certainly be a revulsion against Ukraine, perhaps not in the West, but to an even greater degree across the entire global community outside the West. It would consolidate support for Russia outside the West. And of course, it would also enrage Russian opinion, and it would almost certainly lead to a dramatic escalation of the war. But the Ukrainians never seem to show much concern about that, for that kind of thing. On the contrary, they seem to pursue this policy of assassinations inside Russia, and they've come to the correct conclusion that they will get no criticism for pursuing it from their friends in the West. Contrast this with the Russian attitude. There have been numerous occasions over the course of the war when Zelensky has been well within sight of Russian drones. Apparently, there was one notorious incident when he was in Odessa with the Greek Prime Minister, Mr. Mitsotakis, and they were both being tracked by a Russian drone, but the Russians made no attempt to attack Zelensky at that time, or to kill Zelensky, or do any of those things. And whilst there is no doubt that if the Russians wanted to assassinate Zelensky, they could do so, they have adopted the policy of not doing so. And President Putin has said that one of the reasons for that is that Zelensky is such an unstable and erratic leader. It is not in Russia's interests to replace him with somebody who might be better organized and more effective. That is in fact what Putin said. Anyway, a strange incident, this with Putin in Kursk. I'm not sure that I fully understand what happened. The Russian media is not giving it as much attention, perhaps, as one might expect, given the nature of what is being alleged. And I wonder also, just to say, whether there hasn't been some private criticism of Putin within the Kremlin, whether some officials there might not have said to Putin that travelling by helicopter so close to the border within range of Ukrainian drones is absolutely not something that the president of Russia ought to be doing, given the Ukrainian propensity to conduct assassinations and the fact that they have previously admitted that they made attempts to assassinate him. I will just finish by saying that it is interesting, if this was an assassination attempt, how the Ukrainians got wind of the fact that Putin was in that helicopter and was travelling to Kursk region. Were they tipped off by their Western friends, who after all have much more sophisticated signals intelligence than the Ukrainians do, and who are probably trying to keep track of Putin's movements? If so, then those Western friends would have been actively colluding in this assassination attempt, which is a very disturbing thought. Anyway, to continue, the Russians, it looks like, are coming close to completing the Battle of Volchansk. They've established a strong foothold in Sumy region. There are reports in the British media that they've concentrated a further 50,000 troops on the borders of Kharkiv region. Perhaps they're intending to resume the offensive towards the city of Kharkiv. The British media are claiming that these 50,000 Russian troops are the same Russian troops who drove the Ukrainians out of Kursk region, and now they've been transferred to Kharkiv with the objective of accelerating, intensifying the offensive there. Well, we shall just have to wait and see. All I would say about that is that if that is the case, 50,000 men, as I said this time last year, does not seem to me to be enough to capture a huge city like Kharkiv with a population of over 1 million people. Anyway, that's the first thing. That's the first part of the battlefronts. There continues to be intense fighting in the Kupiansk, Liman area. We don't know whether it is actually the case that the Russians have broken through and reached essentially positions just a few hundred meters from northern Kupiansk. I've not heard any news from there, but it does seem as if the Russians are continuing to close the ring around Siversk. The Russians claimed to have captured the village of Torske a few days ago. This has been contradicted by the Ukrainians, and some Russian commentators have accepted these Ukrainian denials. I believe that Torske is in fact under Russian control, just saying. That's my own personal view. I might be wrong. As I said, I am not there. But further south, things are now taking not just a dramatic, but actually potentially a catastrophic turn. Not only does it appear that the battle for Chasiv Yar is now essentially at an end, as we will see shortly, there is an article in the Financial Times which indirectly appears to admit that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from both Chasiv Yar and, by the way, Toretsk as well. But perhaps most dramatically, it appears that Ukrainian defences south of Konstantinovka have not only collapsed, but that a significant number of Ukrainian troops have been taken into a semi-cauldron following the capture by the Russians of a village, an important village called Romanivka, and the entry of the Russians into another village called Zarya, of which they now control the western and central areas. It seems that the distance between Zarya, the territory on Zarya that the Russians control, and Romanovka is about 3 kilometers. There is a significant Ukrainian force to the south of these two villages. It is surrounded on all sides by Russian-controlled territory. The only apparent escape route is this small funnel, if you like, between Romanovka and Zarya, and 3 kilometers is no great distance through which to travel, especially given that this area is now absolutely saturated with Russian drones, FPV drones, and all of that. So, a disaster playing out there, and one that is getting worse basically by the day. It's not easy for me to get a complete understanding of this very complicated battle south of Konstantinovka. But I do remember saying, roughly a year ago, looking at a map at that time, that it did seem to me that the territory south of Konstantinovka could form an obvious cauldron for the Russians to create, for the Ukrainian forces positioned south of Konstantinovka, and it looks as if that is exactly the way things are playing out. Now, Redovka has provided a very detailed report about this battle, and they are also saying the same, but they're also saying that one of the reasons why the Ukrainians have suffered this disaster south of Konstantinovka, it's an unfolding disaster. It hasn't played out fully, but it's still, as I said, it's still unfolding. Anyway, the reason that Redovka says that this is happening is, again, because the Ukrainians south of Konstantinovka are now desperately short of men and reserves, so that they cannot hold all the fortifications and trench lines that they had created in this area, and the attempt to use drones to hold these positions is simply not working. And I believe that this is correct, and I suspect that this is true pretty much everywhere else across the front lines as well. Now, there's been a lot of further information from other parts of the battlefronts. There has been further reports of more Russian advances towards the key village of Novoekonomichny, east of Pokrovsk, for example, and in the area of the fortified village of Bogatyr, southwest of Pokrovsk, where the Russians are gradually pushing towards the Dnieper. There's been news also there of further Russian advances. I'm not going to devote further time, though, to a summary of the battlefield situation. We're talking about a 1,200 kilometre front line. If I were to do so, if I was to go through every single detail of all of the events taking place, I would be discussing the state of the battle for at least 2 or 3 hours every day. Suffice to say that everywhere the Russians are advancing and the Ukrainians are showing every day less and less resistance, and their resistance appears to be becoming increasingly fragmented and disorganized. Now, all of this is being accompanied with further massive Russian drone and missile strikes right across Ukraine. There was another huge drone and missile strike last night. The Ukrainians also have attempted to launch drones. They launched a similar strike of their own towards Moscow. But if one compares the amount of damage the Ukrainians do, this has been something I've discussed in many programs, with the amount of damage the Russians do with their combined drone and missile strikes, well, there really is no comparison. And the key thing to say is that the Russians are now conducting drone and missile strikes across Ukraine every day. Now, in my previous program, I discussed a previous big Russian drone and missile strike against Kiev. The one which The Guardian said was the biggest such strike the Russians have conducted against Kiev since the beginning of the war. And I mentioned that there are now reports and claims that a Patriot missile battery may have been destroyed by the Russians over the course of this strike. But perhaps the most interesting thing was film preceding the explosion, showing the destruction of this particular Patriot missile battery, or perhaps extensive damage to this battery, in which one could see, almost like fireworks, multiple air defense missiles, presumably Patriot air defense missiles, being launched into the night sky against Russian targets. And I've heard reports claim that at least 20 and perhaps as many as 40 Patriot missiles were launched over the course of that single attack. Now, I understand that the number of Patriot missiles that the United States is building in any 1 month is significantly below that figure. One can see the colossal drain that this air campaign that the Russians are conducting across Ukraine, the enormous drain it would cause to US air defenses if the United States were to continue to supply Patriot missiles to Ukraine. There simply are not that many Patriot missiles. And with the Ukrainians launching 20 to 40 missiles in the space of perhaps 2 or 3 minutes to repel one attack in Kiev, there is no way, if Russian attacks continue at their current rate, that enough Patriot missiles can be produced to provide Ukraine with the necessary air defense cover. And of course, any attempt to do so would catastrophically deplete air defenses throughout the West. So that is the reality. Now, Zelensky himself is very, very angry about the American response to these Russian missile and air attacks on Kiev. He's complaining bitterly about the silence of the United States in response to these attacks. Of course, in the past, President Trump has condemned attacks of this kind by the Russians on Kiev. I remember one message that he posted on Truth Social, in which he actually said that he was very unhappy about one such Russian attack and told Putin to stop. Of course, Putin and the Russians haven't stopped, and Trump no longer bothers. Anyway, Zelensky is still angry about this. He doesn't, of course, just to say, expect Trump to be similarly angry about Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow. And perhaps, being realistic about it, there's less reason for Trump to be angry, given that those Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow have proved so completely ineffective. Anyway, that is the overall military picture as I can see it. But we have now had a very interesting article about this whole situation in the Financial Times. And the article reads, the title of the article is Expect No Miracle. Ukraine braces for Russia's summer offensive. Ukrainian troops struggle with exhaustion, but pledge to fight until we break the Russians' belief that we can be defeated. Well, those last words of defiance are not actually reflected in the article itself, based on what the article says Ukrainian soldiers are saying. So we read that Ukrainian troops on the Eastern Front say that Russian infantry are darting around on motorcycles, buggies and electric scooters. Said Ismailov, a soldier who was once Ukraine's senior Muslim cleric, compared them to a swarm of locusts, not one great wave, but an endless stream. They don't care about losses, they just keep coming, not to take kilometres but meters, wrecked trenches, a few blasted trees, the shell of a house. Well, that's one interpretation as to what these people are achieving. The reality is that, as I said, Russian advances are significantly faster than this. We then read, fighting has intensified in recent weeks around Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, pressuring the strongholds of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and approaching the borders of neighbouring Dnipropetrovsk region. Interesting, the Financial Times, by the way, calls it Dnipropetrovsk, which is what the Russians call it, as opposed to Dnipro region. Is that perhaps a sign that the Financial Times expects the Russians to capture Dnipro region before long? Anyway, we continue to read. Aiding the infantry is Russia's heavy and high-tech weaponry, blasting its way through with glide bombs, missiles and drones, including new models connected via fibre optic cables that make them immune to electronic jamming. Defenders have been forced to pull back from towns, including Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, where the cost of holding ground proved too high. I said that the Financial Times appears to be indirectly confirming the Ukrainian retreat from Chasiv Yar, and there you have it. Defenders have been forced to pull back from towns including Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, where the cost of holding ground proved too high. Maybe that's not a complete admission that Chasiv Yar and Toretsk have fallen. And for the record, I still think that there are some locations in Chasiv Yar which are continue to be held by Ukrainian troops. But here we have an article written in the Financial Times, a strongly pro-Ukrainian newspaper, obtaining its information from Ukrainian sources, and it appears to confirm that the Ukrainians have been pushed back from Toretsk. About that, I have no doubt, but also, importantly, Chasiv Yar. And then we go on to read that though the Ukrainians remain a formidable force, though they are supposedly less dependent on the United States for artillery supplies, we're told that the Russians only have a slight superiority in artillery fire. That, of course, goes completely contrary to what General Syrsky, Ukraine's own chief military commander, has been saying. I discussed all this just a few weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago. He was complaining that the Russians are able to were firing 40,000 rounds of ammunition a day back in the autumn, that this had fallen to 20,000 a day at in the winter at a point where the Ukrainians were firing around 10,000 shells a day. He said that the Russian firing rate has now increased back to around 30,000 a day, 27 to 30,000 a day. And he sort of implied that the Ukrainian firing rate has fallen back to perhaps 5,000 a day, which is the standard of what Ukraine has been able to fire at most points in the war. But anyway, put aside whether the question of whether the Ukrainians have equalized with the Russians on artillery fire. I don't know anybody, by the way, else who thinks that. We then go on to read, and this is in the Financial Times, a deputy commander of an assault unit near Pokrovsk said they were still holding the line, but we're exhausted. He has fought since 2014 through injuries and missing family milestones. Trump's campaign pledge to end the war in 24 hours initially gave him a glimmer of hope, but recent developments have forced him and his troops to ignore the news because it sends them into a rage. It's just noise, propaganda, lies, he says. The war has narrowed his world to the next mission, the next fight, so much so that at times he doesn't feel human. I am a zombie. That sense of exhaustion and frustration is spreading through the ranks amongst both seasoned officers and newly mobilized troops. Morale is fraying, worn down by a growing feeling that there is no clear plan to end the war and that lives are being sacrificed for nothing. Alexander Shushin, a battalion commander of the elite 47th Mechanized Brigade, went public this week with his concerns. His unit operates US-made Abrams and German Leopard tanks, symbols of Kiev's Western backing, but he wrote on social media that even the best equipment cannot operate for flawed planning that sent his men into harm's way. In recent months, it has started to feel like we're being erased, like our lives are being treated as disposable. The problems are systemic, not personal. And the Financial Times says that he's urging a sober reassessment of operational capacity and a strategy that matches the battlefield reality. And then we're told that the war has exposed weaknesses in Ukraine's command structure and the fact that there are significant problems, that manpower remains one of the most pressing issues. At a Kremlin meeting on economic development this month, Putin claimed that up to 60,000 Russians volunteer to join the army each month, double the roughly 30,000 Ukrainians he said were being conscripted. In fact, as is now acknowledged, it is far less than 30,000 Ukrainians that are being conscripted into the Ukrainian military each month. And then there's admissions, interesting admissions from the Financial Times, that Ukraine, having refused to lower its conscription age to below 25, its mobilization drive remains riddled with corruption and forced conscription, including recruitment officers nabbing unregistered men off the street and stuffing them into vans. A recruitment drive to attract 18 to 24-year-olds has largely failed, with only several hundred applicants. I've heard that it's 500, by the way, just to say, according to people briefed on the programme. And then there's talk about how the drone production has been a success, though, as I said in a recent programme, that to me also seems to overstate things. And then we have quotes from Zaluzhny, from that speech that he gave in London, which I've discussed in recent programmes, that Ukraine cannot afford to wait for some kind of miracle that will bring peace, with an enormous shortage of human resources and the catastrophic economic situation we're facing. This is Zaluzhny's words. We can only talk about a high-tech war of survival, and one which uses minimal human resources and minimal economic means to achieve maximum effect, which to me actually does sound very much like expecting or looking for a miracle. Because realistically, how are you going to fight a war if you don't have men, and if your economy is in a catastrophic state? I don't really see how it can be done. So that is the Financial Times. No publication in Britain has been more fervently supportive of Ukraine than the Financial Times. Yet that is the most pessimistic article about Ukraine's
the big question for me
is this that I have read so
Are the
far.
leaders of Europe
aware of this information?
Is Prime Minister
Ukraine,
Starmer, for example,
and
or
they're
President
basically
Macron,
telling us
or
that
Friedrich
Torres
Merz,
and Chasov
or indeed Ursula von der Leyen, are they all being briefed
demoralization
about this?
right
Is
across
Zelensky
the Ukrainian
himself
army
being
that
briefed
conscription
about
is
this?
failing?
I get the sense
the
that
attempts
some
to
people in the United States
encourage young
understand
people
that this
to
is
join
the
in the
emerging
army
picture
have been a
in
failure.
this war. That
But
the Russian advance
do all of these
relentlessly
advocates
of supporting
Ukraine
swarm of locusts,
keeping
according
it
to
fighting,
one Ukrainian
are they
officer,
aware
the lava
of these
flow,
actual
as the Pentagon
battlefield
calls it,
realities that are playing out?
and this
Do they understand
before
the extent
the major
of Russian resolve,
offensive
the resolve
has
that
begun?
has been outlined by
Now,
the US intelligence community?
the big question
who
for
say,
me
who
is,
say that
are the
President
leaders of
Putin
Europe getting this
regards
information?
this war
Is
as
Prime Minister
existential for
Starmer
Russia,
aware
and
of all of
is
this?
resolved
Is
to
President
see it
Macron
through?
aware of all
Do
of
they
this?
understand that through their insistence that the war be continued in some form, what they're doing is that they're playing dice with the future of Ukraine and with the future lives of so many Ukrainian soldiers? Well, I wonder. Actually, sometimes I think that they still believe their own narrative that Ukraine is able to keep fighting indefinitely, provided the support comes, that the Russians have failed to make breakthroughs, and that Ukraine is able to resist them indefinitely. After all, that's what Timothy Garton Ash was writing in The Guardian, and it's possible that they all believe in the drone narrative that it is in fact the Ukrainians who hold the advantage in drones, even though the reality, as I have recently discussed, tells us the total opposite. In fact, just to repeat again, it's likely that before very long, we're going to get as many as 500 Geran drones operating over the night skies of Ukraine every single night, which will, of course, overwhelm the number of Geran drones, Ukrainian drones, can vastly outmatch the number of much less powerful Ukrainian drones that are operating across the Russian skies. And as a matter of fact, I read somewhere else, again in the Western media, an admission, I think it was from Yuri Ignat, the spokesman of the Ukrainian air defenses, that Ukrainian air defense is becoming overwhelmed by the sheer number of drones and missiles that the Russians are able to send out every night. And as we saw in the previous attack on Kiev, the Ukrainians had to launch 20 to 40 of their Patriot missile interceptors, which is an impossible number in terms of production of Patriot missile interceptors. And it's still likely that the Patriot missile battery that launched those missiles was nonetheless destroyed. So this is for me the big question. The trajectory of the war is clear. To my mind, it always has been, but we're getting closer and closer now to the breaking point. And this is even before the big Russian offensive that everybody is talking about. It's before that offensive has begun. Zaluzhny says that Ukraine can't expect a miracle, but what he proposes that Ukraine convert to some great new high-tech war, well, that is expecting or demanding a miracle. Well, I'm not going to say more. All I am going to say is that if anybody really is serious about helping Ukraine, they should advise Ukraine to accept that memorandum that the Russians are drafting and which they're going to send to Ukraine at some point over the next couple of days. All the Western leaders, the Americans as well, that is the actual advice they should be giving to Ukraine, but of course they won't. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More for me soon. Have a very good day.